Hi everyone, I hope you're doing okay. What I said the last time I preached from Philippians still holds true. God can testify how I long for all of you with the affection of Christ Jesus. I miss gathering together, I miss singing together, I miss meeting the new people who come for worship on a Sunday. We are heading into a new future and learning what that looks like together. Today we are beginning a series on the book of Daniel, found in the Old Testament. Now, you might know some of the stories of Daniel if you were involved in church as a child. Stories of fiery furnaces and lions' dens. Or you might never have read this book. That's okay. We'll look at several chapters together over the next few weeks, and you can read along or listen along with us. The Bible Project has a fantastic video introduction to Daniel and other videos on the themes and writing styles of Daniel, so do check those out. This book has a lot to say to us about what it means to live out our faith in Jesus in a world and a culture that does not recognise Jesus as King, even though the book is set centuries before the birth of Jesus. The landscape of Daniel is the landscape of exile. God's people, the people of Israel, and their land have been taken over by a new international superpower, and some of them taken to a new land of Babylon. And all of their outward, visible anchors of faith in Yahweh have been removed. This, in part, is consequence of Israel's disobedience to God and his rule over many centuries. But God's kingdom is now at odds with the kingdom all around them. Daniel and his friends navigate this new landscape, this new normal. Their faith is stretched, but not broken. They have an intrinsic faith, a baked-in faith that perseveres through testing times. As we read, we might recognise afresh that the culture and systems around us, in our context, are often at odds with the way of God's kingdom. As our faith is stretched, how can we remain faithful citizens of heaven and representatives of Jesus where we live and work and share life? As you read through Daniel, you'll notice different styles of writing. There are stories about Daniel, which will feel easier and more familiar to read in chapters 1 to 6, and visions of Daniel in chapters 7 to 12, written in a style called apocalyptic literature. Often this style is misunderstood, as the vivid and imaginative poetry and imagery is taken as a specific blueprint of the future, or speaking of future political and world events. Instead, much of this style of writing speaks directly into the political and world events of the time of writing, although the imagery remains helpful to us to read the signs of the times throughout history. So, let's meet Daniel and his friends as we hear the first part of our reading from Daniel chapter 1.
The reading is taken from the book of Daniel, chapter 1, verses 1 to 21. Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 to 21. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defects, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than other young men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you."
I don't know if your whole world has ever been changed by one sentence. I've got some bad news. You're fired. It's more serious than we thought. We have to leave. Stay home. The whole of Daniel, the context of exile that is so important to the book, is set up in one sentence. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Jerusalem, the city where God's presence dwells, is taken over by Babylon. We read about this in 2 Kings 24. This was not just a political takeover, but a spiritual one, as we read that some of the vessels from the temple were taken to the treasury of the gods in Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar, try saying that 3 times fast, he then takes the brightest and the most talented men, and apparently the most attractive, it's in the passage, from Jerusalem to his court, his government, to re-educate and assimilate them in the ways of Babylon. This included Daniel and his friends. How will they remain faithful to God when they're working for the enemy? Because you see, Nebuchadnezzar and his advisors know what they're doing. If you want to take possession of a people group to undermine their identity and their allegiance to their homeland, what do? You don't just take them as slaves, but you reprogram them to be Babylonian. First, you make them think like you. You make them students of your origin story. You also give them new names, so that every time they are addressed, their names associate them with the Babylonian gods and not the God of Israel. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah become Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those are the names that we remember them as. They're Babylonian names. Hang on, this doesn't say Eve anymore. It says Amazon. Finally, you offer them rich food and wine, symbols of the high life, making them feel special and elite. Cheers! Assimilation complete. But wait, this is where Daniel makes a decision. In verse 8, we read that Daniel resolved or decided not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and asked a court official, part of the hostile surroundings, to help him do it. Until then, it seems like Daniel and his friends went along with the program. They had government jobs, they learnt the language. This doesn't seem to compromise their worship in God. But the food and drink are when Daniel decide that to take it would be to compromise their worship and their identity as God's people. Why at this point? Well, it might have been because the food was likely sacrificed to other gods, or because it would have shown that they were now dependent on Babylon and not on God for their daily sustenance. It doesn't quite say in the passage. But it is where Daniel draws a line, and he doesn't just do it in secret. He invites the opposition, the king's guard, into this small act of kingdom rebellion. He makes his personal faith decision into a public act that invites others to look on and see the impact of his devotion to God. It's dangerous and costly. We are not in exile in the same way that Daniel and his friends were. We've not been taken anywhere new physically, although many of us now are restricted as to where we can go and what we can do. But many of our outward and visible anchors of faith have been removed in recent months. Matt reflected on that with us last week. And we might have noticed in that time, in a new way, how our culture and our systems that we operate within every day are often not in line with the ways of God's kingdom. How we treat the planet, consumerism, systemic racism, economic inequality. Every day, the invitation to assimilate or resist the way of the world comes our way. But what does it look like to live in our world as Daniel and his friends lived in Babylon, but not assimilate to the world's operating system? To be distinctive, to make decisions every day that show that Jesus is Lord. And what happens when we do? Let's read on in Daniel chapter 1.
Verse 11. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance to what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding, about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in the whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. This is the word of the Lord.
Daniel asks the palace official and the guard to offer them only simple vegetables and water for 10 days. I can imagine the other new recruits looking on each day from their banquet to see the impact of this faith experiment. Would they survive? Would their God sustain them? But at the end, they look healthier and better nourished than all of them, and they are able to continue on with their new Babylon-defying diet. God honours their devotion and resistance to Babylon, giving them wisdom and knowledge. And where does this get them? Even higher up in the Babylonian court, with more influence and authority over this hostile power. We'll see where that takes them in future weeks. One thing that strikes me about this passage is that Daniel's faith is intrinsic, baked into who he is. I've recently been given a second-hand bread maker, and Bex, who lives with me, is having a great time making interesting bread for us to eat. Just like the ingredients cannot be separated from each other after the bread is baked, neither can Daniel's trust in God be separated from his identity and decisions. I notice 3 ingredients that go towards Daniel's intrinsic faith and help him, and hopefully us, to make decisions for God in our everyday lives. Firstly, Daniel knew who he was. Daniel acted out of his true identity as part of the people of God, which he knew because he knew the story of God and his people. He will have known the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, really well, and remembered how God had rescued his people from Egypt and how God offers the way of life in all its fullness through obedience to him. We can act out our true identity as children of God by knowing our origin story found in the Bible. There are so many narratives being told about who we are, about what we should do, what to follow, on Netflix, in adverts, on the news. Spending time reading and thinking about the Bible on our own and with others reminds us of our true identity as people saved by Jesus on the cross, sent in the power of the Spirit to proclaim God's kingdom in word and in action, and to see God's kingdom come on the earth. Like Matt said last week, this is what the early church have been doing since Pentecost, and we continue now. Secondly, Daniel was disciplined and devoted in his faith. He had made decisions about how he would live for God before the point of choice. His faith was intrinsic. We'll see in the book of Daniel how he was a person of regular prayer, even when it was costly. The outward support for his faith disappeared overnight, the temple, a bit like our church buildings. But his rhythms of worship and his convictions held secure. Being disciplined can sound a bit restrictive and boring, but it's really about having habits and rhythms that lead to life. We can develop these patterns and habits that help us make decisions for the kingdom every day. And we have more choice than our culture would want us to realise. What we buy and where from, what we consume in food and media, what we say and how we say it. Our choices are not just about what we don't do, but what we do intentionally, like choosing to speak up and against racism in all its forms. Finally, Daniel had friends. They each had their own faith in God, but this was lived out in community. Daniel's friends have their own decisions to make later in the book, and their situation really heats up. Friends are so important, even as we are physically distanced. We can support one another in our lives of faith. We can help one another think through the decisions that we're making about living for Jesus and to stick to those decisions. Small groups are one way that we can decide to invest in friendships and fellowship. If you're not part of a small group and you'd like to be, then let us know and we'll help you get stuck in. Daniel and his friends find themselves in exile, the outward visible anchors of their faith removed. Yet their intrinsic, baked-in faith means they're not lost or taken over, but they remain faithful. They know who and whose they are. They have habits that shape their life and friends to walk alongside them. Do you know who and whose you are? Are you building helpful habits? Do you have friends who can walk alongside you and you them?